little bit more than we do in our presentation. But I have to say that from GAO's standpoint, the pricing model that we have at GAO has worked particularly well for this report. And of course, our pricing model at GAO is free. And so what's happened is that this particular report, which was, I think, a bit of a surprise to us, was the most frequently downloaded report that GAO has published all year, and by a fairly considerable margin. And, you know, we've done work on some fairly important subjects, certainly to the Congress and to the American people, but this particular report really took off and has dwarfed, you know, many of the other reports that we've done, and certainly on some fairly significant areas. So we appreciate, obviously, the interest in that. Now, I'd like to say that the GAO somehow really foresaw the change in the markets and the media, and that we changed our pricing model to do that. Well, in fact, GAO reports have always been free. But what has happened is it's kind of, the world has moved to where we are. You know, I don't think we foresaw it, but we were just lucky. You know, GAO reports have always been free. At least the first report was always free, and then you'd had to pay $2 for each additional copy of the report. And frankly, I don't know that we ever sold, you know, a $2 report. I think everybody just said, you know, first copy, can you give me another one? But of course, one thing we did change was that we no longer print reports at all. We've taken advantage of the fact that the world has changed, and so we've discontinued printing reports altogether. We distribute all of our reports, you know, over the web, and of course they're all free. And so the world has worked very well for us in two ways that are obviously very important. Number one is we've in some ways offloaded a lot of our costs onto the users so that they do all the printing, whether they need to print at all. Many people may not print the reports or just print selected pages. Another thing that's happened, of course, to us is that the distribution, the number of people that are able to get access to GAO reports has expanded astronomically, because you know, a really large report before the distribution on the internet, you know, could have been a couple of thousand reports, you know, and I think that would be, you know, once every couple of years, but probably more typically we sent out a couple of hundred or something of that nature. And you can imagine now how things have really changed. So the world has turned in a way that really favors the model that we happen to have taken on some time ago, and we're quite fortunate and very pleased. And of course, when you have a report that, you know, that reaches an audience that is entirely an online audience, then the effects are magnified. And of course, I think it's one of the reasons why this particular report got so much attention is that, you know, the audience for this report lives online, a lot of communication online, and so there's obviously a lot of activity on that one. I don't know that we realize at GAO, until you do a report like this, I don't think people really realize how fortunate we are that we do have a pricing model which is free. We don't have to worry about collecting and things like that. So we're really quite fortunate. It's worked in our favor. We get lower costs and more readership. So frankly, it's a good story, and it was especially a good story for this particular example.
Clicker there.
Oh, there's a clicker. Okay.
Sorry, this was working a second ago. You know, this window's open. That should.
Oh, actually, fine.
Return.
Well, I mean, it's funny because on the screen here it's changed, but this one seems to have frozen in here. I don't know.
All right. Let's see.
Just a couple things, a little bit of background on what we've done at GAO. We've done actually quite a bit of work on intellectual property related issues. The first one we published, I don't have it up there, we published a report in 2004. We started working on that, I guess, probably in 2003. But in the meantime, we've done about 4 different types of work, and the first one had to do with the roles of the different agencies in the United States in terms of leadership on intellectual property protection. As many of you may know, there's a lot of U.S. agencies that have been involved in trying to organize the U.S. efforts, so we did some work on that. Second set of reports that we did had to do with the work that's done at the border. As many people may know, Customs and Border Protection has a fairly important role in trying to block at least the hard goods that come in across the border. So you have a lot of fake goods coming in from China and other places. Some of those might be pharmaceuticals. Some of them might be brake parts, might be shoes, video game equipment, things like that, in addition to media products, although probably lesser numbers of media products as time goes on. So we did some work on the intellectual property efforts of Customs and Border Protection, and as we often do, we find ways in which they might be able to improve some of those efforts. Then we also did some work on what U.S. agencies do abroad. That report came out last year. And then more recently, the report that we're here to talk about today is on the economic effects of counterfeiting and piracy. So ours is a bit broader than what you generally talk about. It's not just piracy. We also are talking about hard goods, which could be clothing, it could be brakes, it could be pharmaceuticals, and a wide range of other types of goods, not just piracy of movies or music or things like that. So just on the most recent study, the key words in the mandate that we had was the quantification of economic impact. So just a little bit of background on GAO. Those of us that worked on this are with the International Affairs and Trade team in GAO, and so we get requests from the Congress, or we get our assignments from the Congress in three main ways, but let me mention two of those. The first one is there's a request letter, so a chairman or a ranking member of a committee of jurisdiction will write GAO a letter and say, we'd like the Comptroller General to provide a report answering the following three questions. So that would be a request letter. The second, most important way that we get work and our assignments from the Congress is through congressional mandates. This is an example of a congressional mandate, and this had to do with the intellectual property legislation. There were a couple of clauses in that legislation that directed the Comptroller General of the Government Accountability Office, who is our boss, to provide a report to the Congress on a following set of issues. And one of the three issues that had to do with intellectual property here was the quantification of economic impacts. So we set about trying to do that work. Obviously, we've been familiar with that. I have some economics background, and so we were pretty familiar with some of the work that had been done. We were aware from the beginning how difficult that would be, and we were also aware of some of the reports and some of the studies that had been done. So the focus that we had then in this particular assignment was to look at the estimates of the U.S. economic impact, or the economic impact of piracy and counterfeiting on the United States. We decided that the studies within the last 10 years would be the kind of a range of studies that we would look at. Obviously, going back beyond that, many markets have changed remarkably in the last 10 years. So we thought that using that kind of a time frame would be a reasonable bound on the quality studies that we looked at. So in terms of our methodology, we reviewed the studies that were available. What we did was a little bit of a kind of a method of snowball, where you'd ask a couple of experts that have been published on this particular subject. You'd ask them if they knew of other studies, other persons that had contributed to the literature. Then you'd go out and talk to them. And sooner or later, when you do this, you end up with the same names, and there's really not any new people. So we did this for quite some time, and we think we got a fairly complete list of the studies. Of course, we'll have to add Joe's in there if he, when he puts his project out. So if there's any other people that come back and ask about the studies, we'd like to keep that up to date at least for a time. So what we did then was, once we had talked to or looked at it, found a pretty good list of studies, we interviewed a lot of the authors, we talked to other experts, we talked to agency officials, and there's some pretty interesting findings on the agency side, because as many of you may know, this is not an area where the U.S. federal government does collect statistics that are directly applicable to the level of piracy. So we've got some interesting findings on that aspect of it. Now, one thing I think it's worth noting is that one of the reasons why we went the direction that we did in this particular study is because pretty early on we realized that it would be very difficult and impossible really for GAO in any reasonable amount of time to come up with a national estimate of the effect of counterfeiting and piracy on the U.S. economy. But that means we can't respond to the mandate. That means we can't actually answer the question that Congress directed us to answer. So obviously, one of the things that we try to do is we try to obey the mandates. We try to follow the mandates. If Congress tells us to do something, we try very hard to do that. And if we can't do that, we've got to be pretty clear about why it wasn't possible. So a lot of the work that you see in the report that we generated is an explanation of why it's so difficult to actually come up with national estimates of the impacts. And so given that we couldn't do the mandate, we had to provide Congress with some good information as to why we couldn't do that. And obviously the other thing is when we do a report, we obviously want to create something of value for the more general community. So first thing obviously is to respond to our congressional requesters, but the second thing also is to create a publication of some value to the community. So we try to think about how we could meet those two goals. And one of the ways to do that is to provide some insights to people on why it's so difficult to actually come up with good estimates of counterfeiting and piracy. So that's really how we ended up with the study that we did. Now, we do obviously evaluate federal efforts. And so if a federal agency had published a study, it's certainly within our role and our responsibility to evaluate what that federal agency has done. If there is a methodology that they've used, we certainly are comfortable going into that, looking at it in some detail, criticizing it, and making recommendations if we think they're necessary. On the other hand, it's not our role to evaluate studies that have been done by the private sector. Government's big enough. We don't need to go after the private sector studies. I mean, that's not really our audit. Our audit authority is over what the federal government does, not what is done by trade associations and others. Now, by coming out with this set of observations and insights on what are the most difficult kinds of issues and what are those highly sensitive assumptions that people have to make, we think that obviously it gives some insight to those people that are looking at private sector studies. But again, it's not our role to go out and to do evaluations specifically on private sector studies. Obviously, there's a peer review process. There's lots of other ways that that can happen. To the extent that our report is useful for that, obviously, we're pleased about it. But ultimately, our responsibility is to evaluate what the federal government does, not what's done in the private sector. So just going back, a little bit of background, I think the broad outlines about the importance of intellectual property and innovation are fairly well generally agreed. I mean, I know there's a lot of differences when you think about media versus hard goods, and changes over time were quite important. But obviously it was important all the way back in the U.S. Constitution, although how they thought about it way back then before this enormous wave of innovation that's occurred in the United States in the last 150 years, a little bit hard to know what was generating their concern back when it was written into the Constitution. But obviously the IP rights and the ability to profit from your efforts is an incentive to create research and development, and the way that we do it in the United States, whether it's trademarks, patents, copyrights, the roles there and the kinds of design is somewhat different. And I know there's plenty of room for debate as to whether there's an optimal policy, an optimal patent policy, an optimal copyright policy in the United States. But ultimately, what we're doing here, of course, is trying to go back to answer the mandate. But I think it is really important to look back and, whether it's some of the authors in the economic literature, Nordhaus, Baumol, Mansfield, and even people like Morris Abramowitz, one of the things that they did find is that in the last 150 years or so, there's been enormous economic growth in the United States and other countries, and there's been enormous improvements in the standard of living. And when you try to actually factor out what that's due to, one of the things that's quite interesting is that a fairly small share of that has to do with more people or working longer hours. In fact, only about 15% of that improvement in standard of living and economic growth comes about from people working harder. Most of it has to do with working smarter with technology. So obviously there has been this enormous contribution of technology to economic growth and consequently to the standard of living. So I think the broad outlines, of course, I think are generally understood, and the contribution of intellectual property or really of innovation to economic growth and to standard of living is really unquestionable. I think, again, there may be lots of different ways we can think about whether we have the optimal policy, but I think the broad outlines are certainly quite clear. And I think we mentioned that a couple times, particularly in the background of our report. Now, getting to a couple of the findings in the report, one of the things that we tried to do was talk about some of the potential effects, both the negative and the positive effects of counterfeiting and piracy. And so, obviously, there's a lot of material out there that's put out by different associations and others about the health and safety risks of low-quality goods. These are particularly of hard goods, and I think pharmaceuticals are often brought up, and other goods where the quality of those goods or the fake goods could affect people's health or safety in important ways. For industries, there's a fairly lengthy list of negative effects that are cited in many of the studies. As many people know, the sales and brand value, the costs of IP protection, And of course, they also cite the decreased incentive for them to invest in R&D. The government, there's a lost tax revenue, increased enforcement costs, and finally, for the overall economy, there's the risk of lower growth and innovation and declining exports to countries with weaker IP laws. Now, again, a lot of this has to do with goods, maybe not to the same extent with services, but these are the general negative effects that we cite in the report. On the other hand, we did cite some positive effects and lower prices of counterfeit goods. Now, we got a lot of heat for putting this in the report because a lot of people were saying that how can you possibly say that lower prices of fake goods or somebody who's breaking the law can be a positive effect. One of the things that I think is important here is that by definition, this is an economic analysis, and if consumers are purchasing that good and they're getting some value from that good, and they're making that purchase, by definition, there's a benefit there. So we have to be, straightforward. We have to follow the kind of a framework that's been set up here. And so we did get some. I think there's some people who were pretty upset that we would cite positive effects for consumers, but I think people that understand the way that the economic analysis is done, this has to be part of the analysis. And clearly, given the fact that some people are purchasing the goods for a significantly lower price than what they would get. What they would have to pay for the original good, there is room for consumer surplus there. Now, they're not all the same quality as the original. I think you'll probably talk a bit about that in your presentation. But we did include that and got a little bit of pushback from the industry for people that maybe don't have that same framework, that economic effects framework. But again, that's the mandate that we were given. We were told to do an economic effects, so we had to include that. And then finally, there are some examples of places where you might get increased sales of legitimate goods based on sampling or some other testing of the material. Maybe someone buys a fake product and later on it goes and buys the original product. And there certainly are examples around, whether it's in software, whether it might be in some other areas. And so there are indications where you might more or less get the person hooked on the product. They understand it. They come to value the product, and then they may purchase the original. So there are some positive effects that can be cited for industries. I don't know that we knew anything in particular that was a benefit for the government and for the overall economy. It's not obvious. We will talk a little bit about some of the issues having to do with multipliers and others, where you try to come up with the actual losses to the overall economy. And I think some cases those losses may be overstated by some of the studies. But I'll come back to that when we talk about some of the methods that have been used to come up with the overall number. Any kind of questions or clarifications I can talk about now? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
With respect to possible benefits of the government and reduction in unemployment, ever come up as possible?
That would be. It's a little hard to know. I guess it's possible that there would be some people employed, but that would be arguing that certain people are employed in an activity which is certainly not it probably wouldn't be a formal part of the economy. Many of the people that might be involved there would be in the informal economy at best, and possibly in the kind of illegal economy. So that'd be a tough one, but that's not something that people mentioned to us when we did the work. Yeah.
Yeah, just to parallel your benefit to consumers, which I understand why people were upset about this. Surely the same thing must apply to industries that use cheaper technologies or cheaper inputs. So it seems like to make that distinction between consumers and industries, to be consistent, you'd have to say that industries would be.
Oh, I see. In other words, that certain types of, if they were buying machinery or some other goods or software that wasn't the original. So yeah, there certainly could be a benefit for that. And I think, I don't know that it happens as frequently in the United States, but certainly in other countries, you even have government agencies that are using pirated versions. So for them, it would be lower costs, and possibly universities aren't purchasing quite as much software as they'd have to, or they're not spending as much money on software as they might if they were purchasing the original software. Yeah.
So two other positive impacts that are often cited for software goods or any standards-based goods, you get the network effect. So even the illegal copies are blocking people into proprietary standards.
Right. I think we mentioned that in the text. We don't have it in the table, but I think we have it in the text.
And the other one would just be to make sure it's not that sampling drives consumption of the particular good, but it could be complementary goods. So you watch a pirated movie, and then you go out and buy the of license action.
I see. So it's not just the same good, but could extend to some of the other associated products, which could accrue then to that firm or to other firms, whether depending on what kind of a licensing arrangement they might have. Right.
I'm not quite sure how I can make the link between IP and innovation. It would seem to me that somebody who has a hold on the market, let's just say Pfizer, has Lipido, what is the incentive with the kind of IP regime you have, 20 plus years, for the company to look for better and other medication while it can reap the benefits of this monopoly situation that IP gives them? Where is the innovation drive for that company or any other company who has a market lead? Wouldn't you make the argument all the other way around? That you say IP is actually stifling innovation because of the regime that we have, where those who are already leading in the field can even guarantee their lead for 20 plus years.
I mean, I think that's kind of what I mentioned, that there are certainly a very active debate in the literature about, what is the optimal patent or copyright policy. But I mean, the way it's been designed, though, I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that, first off, the firm would not necessarily be willing to innovate and to invest R&D unless there's some ability for them to capture the returns from that. So to create the product in the first place, there needs to be some promise that they can, get rewarded for that. But particularly with the patent policy, there is the requirement for publicity, that you do need to put that information out in the public domain. And as you know, that means that many people, maybe not so easily in drugs, but in certain other products, you can innovate around those patents and try to get that same benefit through other methods. So it is a balance. I mean, certainly you want to create some ability for that firm to benefit from it. At the same time, there is the requirement for publicity, and there is a time limit. So again, the arguments about whether the policy that we've achieved is the optimal policy, or whether there could be tinkering, for example, by different industries, I think that's a fair point. But there is that rough balance that's been created. Obviously we don't have a lot of differentiation by industry or over time in our policies. It's more or less a one size fits all. Doesn't change a lot over time. Those are questions I think that they can be raised, but whether the United States or any other country can really vary that in order to try to target particular industries or change with the times, I mean, that's a fairly tall order to try to optimize that. But that's, I think, some of the discussion that goes on. If you read the literature, there is some pretty good information about whether what we've got is the right way to do it. And of course, there's also the people who are using patents to block innovation by spreading patents very broadly and trying to prevent others from entry. So there's some good and bad kind of implications and incentives for the policy that we've created. Okay. So just looking at the economic impacts, what is it that makes the economic impact so difficult to estimate? I mean, first off, it's an illicit product, and so the fact that these are not formal markets, it makes empirical data particularly difficult to obtain. U.S. government is not in the business of collecting information on illegal goods. There are certain instances. I know the Bureau of Economic Analysis periodically does some work on the gray market and the black market economies, but it's not the kind of thing that would necessarily be sufficiently detailed to inform this particular debate. Also, the industry data, a lot of times industries do studies, and whether they're individual firms or whether they're trade associations, some of these industries actually make a fairly big investment in understanding the effects on their firm or on their industry. Not all of this information is provided in the public domain. If you're a maker of certain kinds of pharmaceuticals or certain kinds of safety parts, you certainly would like to know whether your products are being counterfeited. And if you find that it is, it's not necessarily in your interest to put that out in the public domain, because it could hurt the reputation of your firm. So some of this information could be held proprietary. That's a decision. They make the studies. They invest in the studies, and they may use them for whatever purpose. But that's certainly something that we think that goes on. I think there is some fairly significant effort in the pharmaceutical industry, but as I think people that have looked at the literature here, there's not a lot of information about the extent of counterfeiting in pharmaceutical products. So it's probably, the work's probably being done, but it's not necessarily being put out in the public domain like in the media industry. One of the other things, of course, is that one of the challenges that makes it so difficult is that you can't just do a study in one area and then extrapolate to the industry, to the country, or to anything. I mean, the problem is every particular circumstance is going to be different here. So, you might have fairly significant counterfeiting of a particular brand. When you go to China, what's funny is that you go to some of the places where they sell the counterfeit goods, and on the shelf you find certain kinds of U.S. brand name knockoffs, and other ones they have in the back, that they don't put out on display. And I think it has to do with the level of enforcement of certain companies over there. You can't, so even for purses or clothing or things like that, you can't take one product and extrapolate to other products, because every one of these has very different circumstances and very different kinds of demand curves, and so you can't extrapolate from one to another. You can't take information from the music industry and say it's relevant for the motion picture industry. All of these things are different. All these kinds of variables would have to be estimated separately for each of these brands and for each of the industries, and even over locations, because there's very different levels of enforcement. Cultural factors affect the willingness of people to purchase counterfeit goods. Income levels also obviously are going to affect people's willingness to purchase these types of goods. And then, of course, as we know, technology has changed many of these markets fairly significantly in the past 10 or 15 years. And so a study that was done some time ago really may not have relevance and may no longer be applicable to the markets and the industrial structure that we face now. So these are some of the reasons why, you can do a fairly good study in one industry, but that's not going to help you get a national estimate. So the key assumptions that we mention in the report, there's three that we mentioned. The first two obviously are very closely related: the level of consumer deception and the substitution rate. You can imagine certain goods, for example, pharmaceutical goods. If you're purchasing pharmaceutical goods, it's very possible that some of that fake goods could have gotten into the supply chain. You certainly wouldn't be aware of that. You're probably paying full price for that. And so in that situation, there's probably more or less you think you're getting the legitimate good, and you're not, and so there's probably a substitution rate of nearly 1-for-1 on something like that. Now, then even in the pharmaceutical industry, if you go to Mexico to buy drugs, chances are you have some awareness that what you're getting may or may not be the legitimate goods. You don't know, maybe you're willing to take that risk, depends on your income level, and it may depend on the kind of purchases that you're making. But certainly there's other situations in which the level of consumer deception is obviously very different than that, and you may know very clearly that you're purchasing a good which is not the original good. I mean, if you're buying a CD and it's in a baggie and it's got a Xerox copy of the front, you know you're not getting the original thing. You may be paying 1/10 of the street price, and nobody's being fooled there. Well, of course, then when you're talking about trying to estimate what are the losses to the industry, it's certainly not reasonable to assume that everybody that purchased a $1 CD in a baggie would have purchased the original good for $13 or $15. And so that kind of a substitution rate is obviously a very important factor when you're trying to extrapolate from the number of fake CDs sold to the number of original CDs that would have been sold in the absence of counterfeiting. And I think, of course, in some cases, where you have free goods, a lot of the media that's distributed online, obviously people are not paying for that at all. So trying to come up with a substitution rate for something that's free versus the original price would be even more difficult. And there are ways to do that through surveys and others, but frankly, that's a tall order. And again, you can do it for a particular market, particular time, but to try to get that and then extrapolate, to a whole industry or to beyond is obviously a very tall order. The other particularly difficult assumption is how do you value the fake goods? I mean, if you think about the value chain for a movie or some other product, I mean, if you're talking about someone burning a DVD or a CD in China, the costs of that are likely to be more or less in the pennies. The distribution would add some additional costs to get it to the U.S., for example, in a box or in a container. Getting it across the border to the United States would add, again, a few more pennies. But if you were to price it at the cost of production, even including the transportation costs, you may get up to $1 per CD. That's being fairly, liberal about the cost. Well, of course, once you get into the United States, the market value of that, goes way up. And if you compare it to the wholesale price or the retail price, obviously you're talking about 1 or maybe 2 orders of magnitude. So the assumption as to which of those prices to use for the actual cost of counterfeiting and the impact on the U.S. industry is obviously very important, because you're making an assumption there that could affect your ultimate result by 10 or maybe 100 times. Now, there's no obviously right answer to this, depending on what question you're asking, but I think one of the things that we wanted to point out in the study was that how you value the fake goods has an enormous impact ultimately on the value that you come out with in the end of your study. And I can give one example. Customs and Border Protection does try to value some of the seizures that they get at the U.S. border. And I think one time they seized about 250,000 pirated DVDs, and they called the domestic value $205,000, but the MSRP was $7.1 million. So you can see that the difference between even two methodologies that one agency uses are just enormously different. Again, the factor, an order of magnitude difference in the kind of result that you get. So I think these are the kind of things that when we looked at the studies, these are the kind of things that we pay attention to say, well, do we think this particular study is a reasonable one? And, would we use this? And obviously the Congress, we're trying to give them the information so that when they get people to come and see them and talk about some of the costs, that they also have the ability to look at some of the studies as kind of a user's guide to try to make sense of some of these estimates. So we think in some ways this is some of the value of the report, and maybe it was one of the reasons why this report was so popular on the internet. Honestly, it's still we still wonder about it, but especially with that title. I mean, if you look at that title, it looks like a bit of a snoozer. So I don't know. We're still struggling with that. If you have any ideas on that one, please let us know. All right, so just going in a little bit more about the various approaches that have been used. One of the things that people has talked about is the extrapolation of the seizure data at the U.S. border. Because, if you had the assumption that Customs and Border Protection was able to identify and seize every illegal good that was coming in from abroad, then in some ways that would be at least a gold standard for the level of goods that are imported into the United States and the level of piracy on those goods. But there's a fairly important kind of a caveat there, and that is that you'd have to assume that Customs and Border Protection actually catches every illegal good that comes across the border. And took a couple of phone calls on this, because we did a study that looked at the level of seizures by port across the United States, and we visited a lot of the ports. And when you go out and visit the ports, you become very quickly aware that you can't use that methodology, because the assumption that they're seizing all of the counterfeit goods coming across the border just goes right out the window. I mean, people will tell you, they say, we trip over this stuff at the border, but we just box it up and ship it through, because if you stopped all the counterfeit goods, your offices would be full of fake stuff, and frankly, a lot of them are anyway. And the other thing that we found, and we have this in one of our reports, is that there's a ratio. I mean, most of these ports have kind of the same types of imports. I mean, forgetting for a minute about the ports that have bulk goods, like petroleum and coal and all that kind of stuff. But when you look at the goods where you import merchandise, it's usually not all that different, particularly when you're talking about these kind of express delivery. They're all about the same. There's only about 3 or 4 express delivery airports. They handle about the same level of stuff. But one express delivery port has a huge amount of seizures, and the other one has nearly 0. Well, this it's not based on what's coming in, it's based on how hard they're looking. So, using this as a way to extrapolate, it might be a floor, it's certainly not a ceiling. We wouldn't have any confidence in those numbers. Surveys of supply and demand. You can actually learn a lot, I think, about trying to go and ask people, for example, on downloads and others. I mean, the extent to which they would buy. And this is kind of willingness to pay type questions. As surveys are done in a lot of different industries. It's for valuing any number of things like environmental quality, other things that willingness to pay studies are used quite frequently. There's advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages, they're quite costly. There are some biases, I think, in the way that people answer, depending on how it's designed, but certainly you can get some insights out of the surveys and going out and talking to people. Again, though, they have to be fairly precise, and you learn a lot about a particular industry. The extent to which you can extrapolate from that, I think, is a question. Economic multipliers. These are fairly broadly used and misused by people across the United States for any number of different reasons, way beyond this study. When you talk about spending in the United States, I mean, there's a lot of people use multipliers as if the money that was being spent on one thing wouldn't be spent on anything else. If it would somehow go away and the economy would be smaller. But obviously, if someone is purchasing a CD for $1 rather than for $15, the other $14 doesn't just disappear. I mean, that money's being spent on something else. So whether a multiplier is appropriate in this situation would depend on, with the design of the study, but in many cases, it doesn't disappear from the economy, and it wouldn't be appropriate to use that multiplier to say that the rest of that money is somehow lost. Those people are going to be using that money for some other use, and therefore the use of multipliers is probably not appropriate. But this is true of just about anybody who's trying to argue for one particular type of spending, because they would use the multiplier to say not only would the spending help these individuals, but it also has these multiplier effects. But again, it relies on the assumption that the money wouldn't be used in some other, for some other reason, which is in most cases not appropriate. Other data collection and modeling methods. I mean, there's a variety of folks that have done different kinds of, used other kinds of techniques to do this. You got market data, you've got some law enforcement types of information. Frankly, they kind of go into these rules of thumb for measuring counterfeit trade. I mean, as many people might have seen, there's just people that have said they just believe that 5 to 7% of world trade is from fake goods. Honestly, it's quite difficult to come up with a number like that, for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. So, these broad numbers, it might be handy, and I think people might, like to be able to grab onto something like that, but ultimately, we didn't find that there was, much support for that. And you can imagine, for all the reasons we've talked about, how difficult it would be to come up with a number that would be applicable across all these different industries and valid over time. It's a tall order. Well, one thing we did find, which certainly happened before, is that sometimes there are phantom studies. So we had some phantom studies in this particular area. There were some widely cited U.S. agency estimates that, when we went back to the agency, there's numbers that are being attributed to the FBI and Customs, and can you show us the underlying study? And they say, there's no study. There's nothing there. And so, this happens. I mean, it happens a lot in Washington where someone, might mention it in some kind of a situation that erroneously or purposely gets attributed to somebody else, and then all of a sudden it gets cited a few times, it's in a congressional testimony, and then it's just the number. And it goes on forever. And I don't know whether it's going to change. I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether after having the report, where we pretty much go back and try to track these numbers down and find that there's nothing there. I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether, in fact, they go away or not. I mean, we'll be as interested as anybody to see whether people continue to cite these numbers. And we have told members, or not members, but staff, that some of the numbers they're using in opening statements and things like that, there's no basis for it. And sometimes it changes what they write, sometimes not. So, we'll have to wait and see how that one goes. I think the fact that our report got a lot of publicity, maybe that'll put a damper on it. I do think that one thing that will happen is that the agencies will no longer use it. I think they will be more careful because we pointed out that there's nothing behind it. So I think that CBP, has sent out a memo already to say don't ever use this number because it's not something that we ever, we stand behind. And I think we might have gotten some other communication from some of the other agencies that says, don't use these numbers because there's nothing behind it. And this is what I mean. I mean, we certainly feel it's our responsibility to go after the federal agency efforts. If there's something we think needs to be addressed, we go pretty directly after it. There are some important contributions of some of the efforts, some of the agency, not the agency, but the private sector efforts. There's pretty extensive collection of primary data. You do investigate the dynamics of counterfeit markets. Many of those can inform their own efforts either to stamp out piracy or to reach consumers. So there's some pretty good things. Some of these efforts were fairly significant, and they learn a lot about their own industry. But ultimately, the economy-wide impact of counterfeiting is unknown. And I think, as we pointed out, particularly from an economic standpoint, you have to consider the positive and the negative effects of the, of counterfeiting. And of course, I think the real message here too is, particularly when you think about it, and I know this particular group is more interested in the media side. I mean, technology changes these things quite rapidly. It changes it for the firms. They need to think about their models for reaching the consumer. The government also needs to think about, what it can do in order to, address the problems that are most important. And using limited resources, they have to figure out where they can be most successful, and also where they're making the most difference for the U.S. public, whether it's in health and safety or in other areas. And so that's what I think we're trying to move towards. And hopefully the study that we did will make a contribution in that direction. So I think we're going to go to yours and then take questions afterwards. Is that the plan? Okay.
The original plan, should we stick to it?
Okay. All right, thank you.
First, I want to say thank you to Susan and Mike for having me and for organizing this event. What I'm going to offer today is a preview of a study that's been in the works for some time. I know some of you have heard me say that it was nearly done more than once. I'm going to say again that it is nearly done. And with some luck, it should be available in final form in a couple months. I would like to think by the end of June. The study is tentatively called Media Piracy in Emerging Economies. It's been underway for close to 3 years. It involves 25 researchers or so from half a dozen institutions working on 6 or 7 different countries. I want to begin just by, for those of you who follow the piracy debates at all, I'm sure you're quite familiar with the ways in which they're typically framed. Piracy is often talked about as a plague or a scourge or a dagger in the back of industry. It's connected to organized crime and terrorism, to serious forms of illegal activity, the drug trade, human trafficking. There are analogies drawn to the Boston Strangler. There's a lot of biblical rhetoric, talk about the Dark Ages, the collapse of civilization. I'm sure these are familiar to most of you, just simply as consumers these days, since they tend to be, this kind of rhetoric has been in pretty wide circulation for a long time. And if you look at the industry reports on the levels of piracy, especially in the developing world, there's some basis for the extreme rhetoric. According to IFPI, the International Record Association, 95% of the digital music in the world is pirated. If you look at rates of piracy for China or Mexico, 80% of software in China is pirated. That's down from 90%. 90% of music, 60% of software in Mexico, close to 70% of software in Russia. Video game piracy is routinely estimated at 80 to 90% of the market. And these are big numbers, and they are these are the sort of terms of a discourse organized around the sort of loss to industry. It's the evidentiary basis for the presentation of piracy as a drain on media economies. But when we looked at these issues and began to talk with many of the researchers working on these questions in some of those countries, the question of perspective became important, because one way of looking at a 90% illicit market is to say, well, that is the market. That's not just a drain on the media market. It is the media market. And that's the perspective we've tried to bring to this question. We saw virtually no discussion of that in either the industry literature or in policy debates, or even in the academic literature. The academic record of studies of media piracy is incredibly thin, and the industry research has been the primary source, and in some respects a very good record and a very rich record of reporting on piracy, and in other respects, primarily as it relates to quantitative estimates or some of the evaluation of the social and economic impacts of piracy, a very much less robust record. I won't talk about that in any detail. Much of what we do covers ground that was covered in the GAO report. But when we came to these questions, we really began to think about a set of broader ways of mirror, in some respects, the industry reports because those reports were so effective in framing the debates. So we stuck with the primary industry categories for piracy, music, software, business software, entertainment software, and film. But we wanted to look more broadly at questions of the costs and benefits of piracy, at how enforcement is organized, since enforcement has become a fairly large industry unto itself, all the way from street level enforcement to international policy formation. And we wanted to look more closely at what we really know about piracy, both in terms of the research methods used and the direction of the analysis. So these questions look very different if your primary concern is the ability of rights holders to exploit their goods in domestic markets. It's a rather different set. You come up with a rather different set of questions if you're approaching it from the consumer perspective. If your primary question is media access, and if you approach it from a media access question, then the pirate and illicit markets are part of a single spectrum. They're part of a single media market, in effect. And then the final thing that we paid a great deal of attention to, and that is really the primary issue from our perspective in looking at media markets in developing countries, is the transition from optical disc piracy to a pure digital economy, to digital piracy, which includes but is far from limited to peer-to-peer. There are many more forms of digital distribution that make both the modes of circulation much more complicated and also enforcement efforts much more complicated. So today I'm going to talk primarily about two aspects of the report, one related to the organization of piracy and the other related to the organization of enforcement. And as I suggested, the organization of piracy is interesting to us above all in relation to licit markets. We've tried to look at these markets from the consumer side and not simply the side of legal supply. And we've tried to look at distribution infrastructures as they really exist in these countries, and not simply as a notional idea that with sufficient enforcement enforcement efforts, people would simply choose to purchase illicit goods in their respective local shops, theaters, wherever. In fact, the legal distribution infrastructure in many countries is incredibly poorly developed. There are no legal opportunities to purchase many of the kinds of goods that interested us. And from this, we drew two initial conclusions that also served as the premises of the study to some extent. One is that high prices and low incomes yield tiny media markets. And the media markets for most of these types of goods, for film, for music, for software, in most of these countries is tiny with respect to the US or Europe. And the second is that high prices, low incomes, and digital technologies, cheap digital technologies, yield ubiquitous piracy. And this is essentially the recipe for digital piracy. And with those two as the starting premises, enforcement, it quickly became clear, is really just what happens at the margins of those two relationships. Enforcement is a fairly insignificant factor in shaping pirate markets in our view. We see very little evidence that enforcement has any overall effect on the supply of pirated goods, and plenty of evidence to the contrary, that the supply of pirated goods has increased dramatically in the last decade. We see a number of contexts in which enforcement matters at the edges or within specific contexts. Some kinds of enforcement can be relatively effective at suppressing some kinds of distribution. We see relatively effective enforcement against things like street retail piracy, where the more organized forms of retail can be effectively targeted by police raids, by on-the-ground enforcement efforts. But it's far from clear to us that this has any long-term lasting impact on the actual availability of goods. We see many cases in which enforcement efforts have simply reconfigured piracy. Pirates have adapted in one form or another and opted for other kinds of distribution channels. The deformalization of the street trade is a consistent theme throughout the reports, where instead of disc piracy passing through organized retail with fixed storefronts and people with sort of persistent businesses, it passes through much more transient kinds of street vending, people with their supply of discs on their back who lay them out on a blanket and who can move in a flash if there's a serious threat of police action. So with respect to the organization of enforcement, I really want to touch on two questions today. One is what happens when scarce enforcement confronts ubiquitous piracy? And this is the problem everywhere. Enforcement resources are always scarce compared to piracy that happens just as a matter of daily practice in all parts of the world. And second, what happens when the focal point of piracy shifts from commercial intermediaries to consumers? And we are in the middle of what we describe as a very important turn in both enforcement discourse and the actual practices of enforcement and the laws that shape enforcement, from a focus on commercial intermediaries to consumers. And just to sort of set some boundaries given the time constraints, I'm not going to talk much about data, as I said, although the report goes into data sources and their reliability in great detail. I'm not going to talk much about the specific the differences in industry exposure to piracy, with the exception of the business software sector, which is a very interesting exception to the rules that shape pirate markets for most other kinds of media goods. And I'm not going to talk much about consumer attitudes, which in a nutshell are largely favorably disposed to piracy everywhere we looked. And we unpack that in some detail. It's a more complicated problem than I've just described, but basically the conclusion is that efforts to stigmatize piracy have been a complete failure, and they're a failure for a very simple reason that pirated goods are the only affordable form of access to many kinds of media goods in most parts of the world. And finally, I'm not going to get in much detail into the detail of the country studies, which are very rich and idiosyncratic. This will be mostly an overview of some of the cross-cutting findings. I do want to frame this briefly by talking about what I see as an evolution, and hopefully an important evolution in industry approaches to enforcement, from what I would consider the hard line on piracy, in which pretty much any form of unauthorized access to media is treated as a form of theft. And this is something that used to define the whole debate. And this was it. This was Jack Valenti in the 1980s talking about the VCR. It's Jamie Kellner in 2002 talking about TiVos. It used to be the standard line. I think you've begun to see a real evolution as you have a sort of generation of media executives who've grown up in the digital era and who have begun to appreciate how intermingled the licit and illicit economies are and how complicated that line is. For me, it was really exemplified by a statement by Robert Bauer in the course of one of our interviews. So just a very different understanding of what piracy means in relation to the licit media economy. And a very different role for industry as it tries to legalize larger shares of the market, while also recognizing that there are going to be parts of that market that are simply unservable through legal business models, and that's okay. I'm not sure he'd say it's okay, but the implication is that it's okay. And the problem with the current debate, in my view, is that the enforcement debate continues to be organized around this older discourse, right? Zero tolerance, no enforcement measure is strong enough. Every time the enforcement measures fail, the solution is further enforcement, stronger enforcement. And a business model debate organized around the last statement. So the enforcement conversation and the business model conversation, as we look at the media landscape, are really, they're organized around two rather different views of what the meaning of licit and illicit markets is. So I want to unpack this question a little bit through the question of prices and incomes. It's really a very simple set of points, but in our view, looking at the relationship between prices and incomes provides a rather revealing window on the structure of media markets. And this is simply it shows you GDP per capita in the countries we were looking at. What you find, generally speaking, is, of course, huge disparities in GDP per capita as you look around the world, the differences between the US and India, the differences between US and middle-income countries like Russia or Mexico, and a much narrower range of variation in media prices. So this is not an ideal set of comparisons, but these are average ticket prices in some of the capital cities in the countries that we were looking at. And The key point to keep in mind is that markets for media goods, markets for film, markets for music, markets for software are, in most places, overwhelmingly controlled by US-based multinationals. The Microsofts, the Hollywood studios, the big four record labels. And the norm, the rule, is that prices in developing country markets are set at Western levels. Right? We see this in market after market. There are always variations. There are a number of cases where prices will diverge from that. So if you look at the ticket prices in Johannesburg or in Mexico, you see a break from what would be the sort of standard floor for media prices. And that tells you that there's something going on there that is departing from the norm, that is producing pressure on that media market. And the part of the richness of the country studies was really to begin to unpack those variations and look at the ways in which these markets are structured differently, either through different patterns of ownership or different patterns of enforcement, or different geographical sort of organization of the markets. And I'll come back to this a couple times. But to look at it in a bit more detail, this is The Dark Knight, the biggest global hit of 2008, pulling in over $1 billion. And it was also the most pirated film of 2008, which is a fairly typical relationship where the biggest hits are also the most pirated. And what you see in this column is the virtually cartel-like pricing structure for DVDs in global markets. There's a floor for prices for big international releases that almost never dips below $13 or $14. Sometimes it goes higher in function of things like taxes and other kinds of sort of market influence. This is a story that is strongest in the DVD and software markets, where software too is priced uniformly throughout the world at Western prices at retail. So if you want a copy of Windows or a copy of Office in Moscow or Delhi or Sao Paulo, you're going to be paying the same prices. It's a little less true in the theatrical market, as we just saw, and in the CD markets. Music markets are a bit more complicated in how prices are set, given the role of local repertoire and sometimes more significant local ownership of record labels. But by and large, it's the norm, and it's certainly demonstrable preference of these international media companies to simply maintain uniform pricing. And to sort of better render the impact of these prices on people's actual capacity to purchase, we translated them into what we call the comparative purchasing price, which essentially it's the price Americans would pay if the good represented a comparable share of per capita GDP. So if, for an American, a $24 CD would be $24. In Russia, given that Russian GDP is about a fifth that of US GDP, the relative price is about 75, and the numbers go up from there. This is it's a bit gimmicky. What it suggests is that DVDs, CDs, trips to the theater, in most middle and low income countries are luxury goods. These are luxury purchases. These are not mass markets. If you apply the same exercise to pirated discs, you see that the pirate market is basically serving the domestic markets at something closer to the sort of relative price of U.S. and European markets, where the price differential is just much closer to what would characterize a mass market in the U.S. And just to highlight another point that this sort of pricing chart brings out, there's a history of piracy that the report covers. And it's really the history of the increasing commoditization of optical discs, where circa 1999-2000, in any of these countries, if you were buying a CD or a DVD, it would have been $5. The history of the last 10 years is, in the disc market at least, is the history of cheap Chinese burners, storage, the emergence of very low-priced, commoditized digital consumer technologies that have crushed pricing. I mean, they have just pulled those retail prices from $5 down to under $1 in most cases. And again, this is where it's going. toward the CD or DVD for under $1 for a high-quality product. And anywhere where it's higher, you really have to start looking at what the social organization of piracy and enforcement look like. So in South Africa and Brazil, they have relatively extensive police enforcement against optical disc markets. Enforcement can raise the prices in certain markets. There's a geography of piracy that matters, so that markets that are selling to primarily middle class or tourist publics have higher prices than the ones that are serving sort of working class commuters or other less visible populations. The U.S. at this point is a niche market, and as a niche market, it has relatively high prices. So we spent quite a bit of time looking for pirated DVDs in New York. 10 years ago, they were, or even 5 years ago, they were commonplace in Chinatown. You could find street storefronts with DVDs in the windows. Today, that's no longer true. It's been completely deformalized. Occasionally, you can find street vendors unfolding their blankets full of CDs. You see them occasionally in the subways, but it's a niche market. It specializes really only in a handful of hits that are still in the theater. Often you get a crummy camcordered version. And it's priced simply to meet what they perceive as the disposable income of the consumer. Russia has been an interesting outlier for us. Russia is the country with the highest cost pirated goods in the world, in part because the Russians were very effective at crushing middle and lower tier production and distribution in the course of a major crackdown in 2006, 2007. What that did was eliminate all the low-cost competition for the big pirates, who generally benefit from state protection. So, what you have now is a pirate market in which the big producers are either operating on military bases or in prisons or in some cases in mental hospitals. These are pieces of the story we've documented, not in much detail for obvious reasons. This is dangerous terrain to be investigating in Russia. And the whole tier of production that drove down prices in countries at the lower end of this spectrum is gone. The police were very effective at driving out the people running cheap burner labs out of the backs of stores. And so the top tier pirates have maintained enough control over the market to maintain high prices. And the other thing that's interesting about the Russia case is that the same factors are typically producing the licit and the illicit copies. So you have a massive production of what is genuine counterfeit. So in most other countries, counterfeit and pirated goods they're just bifurcated as practices. Nobody's buying something they think is a legal DVD in a kiosk or certainly not online, right? I mean, there's no real confusion at work. In Russia, it's very much still there's still a very strong presence of counterfeited goods because of the role of these big factories, which hold the contract for licensed goods, and then the late shift is about producing exactly the same discs for sale through pirate markets. So Russia's turned out to be just a fascinating outlier in this work. If you look at domestically produced hit films, we had sort of hypothesized at the beginning that this question of global Hollywood dominance of the film market would mean that there would be a bigger opportunity for local film companies to cater to wider audiences. Not the case for major productions in most of these countries, and that is largely because Hollywood dominance of the production and distribution channels really make any large-scale production in a middle-income country already part of the Hollywood global production and distribution system. They're already integrated into global Hollywood. And then as a result, they're really compelled to adopt the pricing structure that the big Hollywood firms set. So there's very little discounting for domestic audiences, even by films that are predominantly identified as domestically produced. And of course, the financing is very complicated. There's no such thing as a purely domestic film anymore in most countries. That's very different in the couple countries that we looked at that have local film markets dominated by local companies. So in India, the usual percentages are reversed. It's not 80-20 Hollywood, it's 80-20 Bollywood. That's true in Nigeria, too. There's a huge Nigerian home video industry. And what you find, or what we found, is that when there are domestic companies with enough stake in the domestic market and enough control over the market to set prices, they compete like crazy. They compete for local audiences. They compete on price. They compete on services. Prices go down to a level that's competing with the pirated goods. And that is one of the takeaways from our report. This pricing model, the only consistent and reliable way to break it is domestic ownership of media companies. The multinationals fundamentally aren't all that interested in competing for larger publics in the developing world, in large part because their primary interest with these pricing models is to protect their high-income markets. Right? They're much more interested in protecting the pricing structure in high-income markets than they are in competing down market in developing countries. And just to provide a counterpoint, I mean, this kind of competition is happening, of course, in the US, where you see the emergence of very low-cost media models through things like internet streaming, internet distribution, Hulu, Netflix, Redbox. In countries where the media companies are genuinely interested in competing for audience, this competition is rampant, and it's transforming those industries. And it's transforming it in ways that are creating legal competitors at pricing levels much closer to the pirate level, to the pirate market. In developing countries, we've seen experiments where Warner Brothers or Microsoft sort of test the waters with lower cost products, but it's really only been as a set of market tests. There's been no enduring investment in these kinds of lower cost business models. And that's why, again, it comes down, from our perspective, to ownership. I won't spend any time on it, but you could do the same kind of exercise with music. This is Coldplay, the biggest international hit of 2008. Business software sales, as I mentioned, it's a very boring story because the prices are all the same at the retail level. And just before I shift to a discussion about enforcement, are there any questions? Jonathan.
So, and you might not be able to answer the question because this is more, business strategy. But given that, as you say, these low-income markets, that there is such a tiny media market for the high end, why do the multinationals care about what goes on in those markets? I mean, or is the fact that even if they can sell, the 100 CDs in that country at full retail value, is that why they're, they have the 301 list? I'm just trying to understand what their real goal is. Given that the people that don't have any money to buy at full retail value, why beat up on these countries?
Well, they are happy to be in those countries. Those are not markets without value to them, and they are markets that grow at the speed of income growth. And in some countries, that's been very fast. So the cinematic market in Russia has quadrupled in the last 7 or 8 years.
If they're selling to 1 or 2% of the market, that's still not.
Basically, they're happy to sit and let incomes rise to the point where more people can afford their goods. Domestic companies that are genuinely competing for audience are on a very different track. I mean, they're tracking the pace of technological change rather than the price of income change. And the implications of that are radically compressed pricing around any kind of distribution or reproduction. So that I see as the dilemma. I mean, the countries are, due to the influence of the multinationals in most of these domestic media markets, they're kind of stuck on the income growth track as far as how their media markets evolve and not the technological track. And over time, of course, some of those models that are developed in the US will get imported, and you see that beginning in things like mobile telephone download models, But generally speaking, there's no pressure on them to compete at a much broader level in these countries. It'll be a trickle down. And the implications for policy are that the policy will remain an obstacle to that shift, insofar as policy ends up kind of locked in this fairly fundamentalist model of zero tolerance for piracy.
On the same point, is there an interest on the part of companies to sort of protect an idea of a global standard price, and if they start discriminating more in different markets, that would sort of set the idea in consumers' minds that pricing can be like, or is that not so much?
I think that's very much a concern with respect to their high margin markets. You know, and of course the fear that the companies always raise is there could be, you know, they don't do that because of the fear of parallel importation. So if you can buy a copy of Windows in China for $10, you're going to get massive transfer of those goods into U.S. markets where they're selling for $300. You know, that seems to me to be an addressable question. That begins to be a trade and enforcement question that seems much more reasonable to me than the kinds of consumer-directed enforcement that are being contemplated in many of these countries. So if it's a question of intercepting parallel imports at the border, I'm much more comfortable with that than I am with maintaining $300 pricing in China and tolerating widespread piracy, but going after people in a somewhat random way. That's something I'll come to in the software market, but the parallel importing question is fairly prominent in these conversations, and for, I think, the wrong reasons. Mike?
I want to follow up on Jonathan's question, because I understand sort of the private interest in maintaining high margin markets, but do they really if the rights owners had the world that they purport to want, I question whether they want that, because aren't they afraid of import substitution? What do people watch? What do people listen to if the only people who get to afford CDs or Hollywood movies are the very rich? Is there going to be a vacuum in culture, or won't people create a culture so that the income growth stories doesn't sound rational to me? Because in fact, you're driving people into this other market, and as incomes grow, they're not suddenly going to switch their tastes to Hollywood now that they have a little more money. Or is that the belief?
Well, I don't think it's an irrational. So film is it's always dominated by Hollywood in every country of the world except India and Nigeria. European markets, 80+% of the market. And countries with what you think of as fairly established domestic film industries are still just a small portion of those domestic markets. Music is different. Most music is local repertoire, even in rather small countries where you wouldn't expect it to be a big factor. The publishing of that music, however, is still dominated mostly by the big four record labels. So I think piracy has emerged as this compromise. It's emerged as the thing that fills the gap between demand and legal supply. And I don't think it's, whether it's rational or not is a different question. I think it's bad for developing countries, and whether or not it's a rational bet from the perspective of the media companies is a harder question to answer.
What effect then do you think the present regimes have on the creation of indigenous media industries, or call them creative industries? Couldn't you then make the observation that if all these legal regimes which we have now in place, coming from the developed world, are really retarding the development of indigenous creative industries in developing countries for all the reasons that you mentioned? And is that a goal that we should actually underwrite?
Oops. Well, I think what you point to is very much a part of what we would see as the policy goals for developing country governments to foster more domestic cultural production. What you see in the industry input into the Special 301 process in particular is an attempt not just to enforce intellectual property laws increasingly, but to ensure that there are fewer and fewer opportunities for developing countries to do that. So the IIPA has begun to introduce what are called market access, concerns about market access that are not directly related to intellectual property, into these intellectual property enforcement proceedings, so that they go after Indonesia for setting open source software procurement policies. They go after countries that are setting sort of cultural production quotas for domestic film or music. This is an interesting shift in enforcement discourse, which, I mean, open source software really has nothing to do with piracy. It has nothing to do with respect or lack of respect for intellectual property, but it's increasingly perceived as, well, I'll come back to the software question and why the piracy, why piracy, commercial markets, and open source are sort of inextricable. And the whole stake in software enforcement, in my view, in developing countries is about excluding open source alternatives. Because those are the real threats to market share, not the pirate market is if anything, a real source of value to most of the commercial firms.
It's interesting how we use these terms. Piracy connotes, of course, something very negative, right? It gives kind of a moral, shady characterization of what's going on. What is really happening is that the dominant market structures prevent these countries from creating their own mechanisms that we have here. Or am I totally off the market?
No, I think that's right. I mean, it is a moralized discourse very deliberately. And I'll come back to that too, because I think that what it prevents is the articulation of a reasonable end game to enforcement. And where is it going? And as soon as you've spent 20 years investing the question with all these questions, this whole rhetoric of theft and collapse of civilization and starving artists, then it becomes very difficult to countenance an acceptable level of piracy or an acceptable degree of permeability of these markets. Jonathan?
Well, just, yes, building back to Mike's point, it would seem that there is this, if the multinational companies are still high prices in these markets, and as you say, the gap is filled by infringement, you could, I guess the argument could be from a domestic point of view in foreign countries that cracking down on the infringement would facilitate, as long as the foreign product prices are high, that would facilitate the growth of the domestic industry. I mean, just like if you have in India and Nigeria, that if the gap were filled by Finnish films or whatever, Brazilian films in Brazil, rather than infringing copies of Hollywood films, that would arguably be a good thing for Brazil. Isn't that right? That could be the argument as to why Brazil should be very strict on infringement, because the gap would be filled by domestic content as opposed to by Hollywood content, because the Hollywood people wouldn't be willing to lower the price.
Well, I think that's true when, I mean, it's not so much about domestic content. I mean, already most domestic content is integrated into global media, into the global media business. It's about both the production of domestic content and control of the distribution chain. And if you have enough of those two things, then you can begin to have some impact on the structure of the market. You can begin to impact price. You can begin to compete on services. I mean, in general, we think, I mean, personally, I make no judgment about about people's preferences. If they want to watch, if they prefer Hollywood films over domestic Brazilian films, that's at some level that's a matter of choice. But it's a choice that's in fact dramatically shaped by questions of market structure. So that domestic films are the financing of them is very weak. The distribution infrastructure for them is weak. They're compelled to price at levels that are unaffordable to local audiences. And there are a whole range of reasons related to the structure of markets dominated by Hollywood films that create barriers to a vibrant local culture. And that's, it's those kinds of issues that I think are important for domestic cultural policy. Susan, how are we doing on time? I know we're past our cutoff point. I could wrap up, or I could finish out fairly quickly.
We can finish out fairly quickly, and then we'll still have plenty of time for this.
Okay. All right. Well, to talk in a bit more detail about 3 questions related to the organization of enforcement. I want to come back to this question about the relationship between piracy and organized crime or terrorism. I want to talk about the business software market in a little bit more detail, following up on some of these questions. And then finally, the question of what happens when scarce enforcement confronts ubiquitous piracy. So to give away the punchline at the outset, we have found no systematic connections to drug trafficking, prostitution, or other major features of organized crime. If you follow the debates, you'd be very legitimate. You'd be very justified in thinking that this was a crazy outlier finding. That if you listen to the industry reports, to the Department of Justice, to Interpol, when statements about the connections between piracy and organized crime are just ubiquitous in this space. Claims about connections to terrorism became very popular after September 11th for reasons that you can ascribe a fairly cynical political motive to. Sorry, I'm going to pull this. Let's see if that stops interrupting the slides. Very superficial level, the political advantages of connecting copyright infringement to much higher order crimes is obvious. The conflation of piracy and much more dangerous forms of counterfeiting is also fairly rampant in this space, where most industry studies, most government studies draw no distinction between the two. Piracy and counterfeiting are mentioned in the same sentence. For reasons we've just been through a little bit, we see these as increasingly separated phenomena. But the biggest driver of the pirate market, and the reason why we found no systematic connections, is this question of price, right? So 10 years ago, when a CD or DVD cost $5, that was a fairly high margin good, right? The markup over production cost was pretty high. The costs of production were such that you had producer countries and consumer countries. The pirated disc trade was organized through networks of cross-border smuggling. Cross-border smuggling for goods that operate on a high margin are going to attract criminal activity. The story about criminal activity was much more compelling a decade ago. Over the course of a decade, as prices collapse, you have fewer opportunities for any serious criminal involvement. Production moves local because it's concentrated. It's just conducted at a much smaller scale level, where it has become largely a cottage industry of people burning discs in the backs of stores. Production on the order of hundreds or thousands rather than hundreds of thousands or millions.